Welcome to the Leadership for Society series, People and Planet in the Information Era. Today, I'm discussing democracy and governance in the digital age with Congressman Lofgren, member of the U.S. House from Northern California. Thanks for joining, Congressman Lofgren.
Thanks, Professor.
So you're the only member of Congress to have been both a part of the Nixon and Clinton impeachments and serving as the first manager for the impeachment of President Trump. And you were also a member of the Judiciary Committee during the second impeachment of former President Trump.
Yep.
That's a lot of the experience with with impeachments. What was your takeaway from those
Judicial
experiences?
impeachment as well.
What's that?
A few other judicial impeachments as well.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about how technology has affected how impeachments take place.
Well, and that's a difficult question to answer. Taking a look, I mean, there's only been 4 modern presidential impeachments. The last 3 were in the television media age. The first, Nixon, was very different. And I think it was not so much the proceedings, but how the public perceived what was going on. During the Nixon impeachment, and I was just, I was a law student. I mean, I wasn't in charge of anything, but working on it, the members took it very seriously. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. The news was delivered through mainly 3 news channels and written press, and there was no alternate truth. And so people who were divided when the committee began, as they saw the facts, had to come together and have a bipartisan vote in the committee to impeach President Nixon. In contrast, the Clinton impeachment was fed by a media frenzy. As you remember, it started as an investigation of the so-called Whitewater scandal, which never really was explained, and ended up with the late Ken Starr finding out about an affair that the president had with a young intern, which we're still waiting for an explanation of how lying about sex was transmogrified into a high crime and misdemeanor. But it was really a frenzy about how to get the president for political purposes, fueled by the media. And of course, the latter 2 impeachments really involved a president who used social media to try and overturn the government in a way that is really unprecedented. So technology's had a role in the behavior.
Yeah, so you mentioned the last one in the role of social media. What were the relevant findings? Because you also were part of the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attacks. What were the findings that were relevant about the use of social media?
Well, we found that they played a key role. You'll see woven throughout the report that the Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms were used to inflame passions and to transmit falsehoods. We had very compelling testimony from insiders at Twitter that Twitter knew what they were doing and decided to do it anyhow. Certainly, some of the analysis that we did with our outside data scientist team did prove, I think, that the algorithms in use in some of these platforms really directed activity towards right-wing radicalism. No matter where you started with the inquiry, you ended up with right-wing extremism on the platform. So there's a very serious, it's not what caused the riot. And Trump has that responsibility, but the social media tools were a tool that he used effectively.
And how do you think about the responsibility of the private companies, right? Because you mentioned it's a tool and tools can be used for good or ill. And how do you think about the responsibility of the organizations like Twitter or Facebook that are used as a tool to support things like the insurrection?
Well, I think they should shoulder some responsibility, but if you take a look, especially at Twitter and Facebook, it looks like they were more focused on their bottom line than their responsibility to society. the more clicks you have, the more money you make. And they make a lot of money with extremism.
I see. And thinking about the insurrection, one of the bills that you co-sponsored with former Representative Liz Cheney was aimed at reforming the Electoral Count Act. Can you
Right.
tell us a little bit about what that bill would have done?
Well, actually, a variation of the bill was adopted as part of the omnibus bill. If you take a look, and this was not to excuse what the ex-president did, what he did was clearly illegal and in violation of the anticipation of the 12th Amendment in the Constitution. But the archaic language in the act, it's more than it was written in the 1800s, invites mischief. And so we worked to clarify the language to make sure that it was obvious that the vice president is obvious, but there could be no question that the vice president's role was purely ministerial and some other cleanups. The bill we passed, the House, was really, we thought, pretty good. The Senate, for reasons we could never fathom, we sent a actually pointed letter to a bipartisan group of senators to please explain the use of the word regularly given, which they couldn't do and never answered. But in the end, they came up with some improvements, and we decided it was better to take the modest improvements they were willing to agree to than to do nothing. And so those compromise elements were included in the omnibus appropriations bill at the end of the Congress.
I see. And what efforts are next? So as you think about trying to shore up the kind of weaknesses that you described in the democracy, democratic process in terms of the counting, like what do you think needs to be done next?
Well, we had a whole series of recommendations in the in the report, all the way from examining the use of the Insurrection Act to penalties for trying to overthrow the government and the like. It does not appear to me that the new Republican majority in the House of Representatives is very interested in doing any of those things. In fact, a majority of the Republican members of the House voted to overturn the election. And the new speaker has appointed election deniers into key positions on committees throughout the House. So I'm not optimistic that the reform that's necessary will be seen in this Congress.
That's a pretty pessimistic view. So I'm wondering, as you described it,
pragmatic view.
Okay, pragmatic view. What are we supposed to do if elected officials from a major party aren't willing to support electoral reform and are, in your perspective, willing to go along with challenges to a fairly run election?
Well, in the end, it's up to the voters. I think when people vote, they ought to think about not just taxes and position on choice and the like. They ought to think, is this person willing to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic? And a majority of the House Republicans, whether they fully appreciated what they were doing, voted to discard the votes of the American people, I think in contravention to their obligations to the Constitution. So that's something voters need to decide.
I see. And speaking of that, what do you think are the biggest threats right now to our democracy? What should voters be paying most attention to?
Well, there's a lot of things. I think a fundamental problem that we face right now is a lack of consensus on reality. And, we've got members in positions of power who think that forest fires were caused by space lasers controlled by George Soros, for example. We may think that's laughable. I do. It's nutty. But there's a group of people who believe this, and they have positions of power. We need to have a consensus on reality. You can have disagreements about various strategies or positions, but if you don't have an agreement on what's real, it's very difficult to make progress. I think ultimately that's an important thing that we need to get settled. Obviously, we have competing philosophies, and there are differences. I mean, there are differences among members of Congress, and certainly the Republican members of the House, I don't think, for the most part, fairly reflect Republican voters in the United States. But I do think sort of extremism needs to be rejected. I don't think that's where people are. And, one of the things, I found this working with Liz Cheney, she and I don't agree in so many things. And yet, we do have a strong commitment to the Constitution. So we were able to work with each other, listen to each other. I think my idea might be the best, but let's listen to the other person's idea and see if we can make progress together. That's what the American people would like us to do, I think. And you don't get that by being an extremist.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the example you gave of people believing that space lasers cause forest fires, and they're directed by George Soros. I wonder, to what extent do you think those beliefs, at least among the leaders and elected officials, are those cynical beliefs because they serve their goals, or are those true beliefs? And the reason I ask is because technology plays a role in allowing cynicism to be used as a way to manipulate voting, perhaps. So I'm wondering to what extent these are legitimate beliefs, and to what extent this is really just an attempt to take advantage of tools available to them.
I think it's a mix, and obviously I can't answer for the views of my colleagues, but from their behavior and their statements, it does appear that a subset of Republican House members have beliefs that are untethered to reality. I happen to know that there are quite a few Republicans who I work with who realize that those views are not true, that that's nutty. The question is, what do you do about that? If you've got your party marching down, a nutty road, do you stand up or do you just stay silent? And I think what the Republican conference did to Adam Kinzinger and to Liz Cheney shows what the party is going to do to anyone who says, hey, the emperor doesn't have any clothes on. And so a lot of people who are perfectly sane and perfectly decent legislators are keeping their heads down.
Mm-hmm. And so I think about that. I wonder, going back to the technology, obviously free speech is a bedrock of our democracy, but the proliferation of misinformation is undermining our democracy to some extent as well. How do you think about the balance between free speech and content moderation on these powerful social media platforms?
Well, content moderation is something that we urged in the January 6th report. Certainly, I believe that platforms have an obligation to intervene when there is obvious misinformation, exhortation to violence, and anti-Semitism. What can be done legally is a different question and a complex one constitutionally. I do think that there are things that, and we did say we need to have the committees of jurisdiction take a look at how we might more effectively have these social media platforms take responsibility. If it were easy to do, I think we would have done it long ago. It may be that transparency of algorithms may provide greater insight into what's happening. Adobe has a very interesting new technology that will allow people to discern when a media, an image or video has been manipulated. I think that, it's not the whole answer, but that's helpful. I think there's going to be a multiplicity of things that need to happen in order, and that's nothing compared to what we're looking at as AI. I mean, AI is developing. I was talking to some of the scientists recently who thought AI would be, about 2030, where it is like this month. So it is really coming and roaring at us. And in terms of a legal framework, we are unprepared.
Mm-hmm. And so, speaking of advances in technology, I want to turn a little bit to digital organizing in elections. So it's been widely recognized as maybe a turning point in electoral politics. The Nixon-Kennedy debate in '60, went from radio in essence to TV and what that meant. And you could argue that we're undergoing kind of a paradigm shift right now.
Right.
right? That you must be savvy in terms of use of social media to run elections effectively. What do you think about how those shifts are going to continue to affect electoral politics?
Well, right now we're at a transition point. If you take a look at the analyses, especially for certain demographics like people over 50, television is still the most effective mode to reach people with information on campaigns. For people under 25, certainly social media is way more effective. They're not watching the TV news, and people in between are a mix. So as we move forward, the use of social media platforms has increasing importance. I will say, if you take a look at the age of members of Congress in both House and Senate, we're not in the under 25 demographic. It's not even legal to be a member of the House if you're under 25. So there is a little disconnect between the elected officials and the way information is disseminated, and we count on our younger campaign staffers to make us savvy on that. And then certainly there are members who are very tuned in, and then members who don't have a clue. So, and you wouldn't necessarily know by looking from the outside in.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering how you think about political targeting through social media. So early on in the first Obama election, like there was a lot written about how he was using these kind of targeting technologies really in a savvy way to cultivate a group of committed voters. And then Trump, you'd argue, did the same thing, not to the same effect necessarily, but basically similar kind of tactics. How do you think we should think about political targeting, and should it be limited in some way?
Well, I think one key to that is to take a very aggressive approach to protecting individual privacy, because if you have the capacity legally to compile every piece of information digitally about a person, then you have the ability to use that information to manipulate that person either for political or commercial purposes. Congresswoman Anna Eshoo, Anna represents Stanford. She and I introduced the most expansive digital privacy bill ever introduced in Congress in the last Congress that would drastically limit what private information could be compiled. But this has been used very effectively. One of the things, we didn't put it in our report because it was about the 2016 election, not the 2020 election on January 6th, but information we received that churches that had information about people seeking counseling for drug, alcohol, and mental health vulnerabilities sold that information to the Republican Party, who then manipulated those individuals for the Trump campaign. I doubt very much that those individuals realized that going to their pastor would result in being manipulated politically. Certainly, the Obama campaign didn't do something, I think that's frankly unethical, but they did use pieces of information about individuals to draw conclusions about who might be receptive. Of course, the information that's being collected in now compared to 2008, there's no comparison. I mean, you can basically, you can reconstitute a person's almost entire personality and political views and commercial behavior with the information that has been assessed.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was going to ask about. So I understand privacy, but these days there's so much information that's publicly available. You can probably do what you're saying without going toward any private information. How do you think about limiting that, or should that be limited?
Well, the question is, I mean, one of the things that in our privacy bill, Anna and I, that you cannot keep personal information if you're an online vendor for longer than necessary to do the tasks that being offered, nor can you get more information than you need to do the task that has been offered. So yes, you may give your information to platform X because you want a particular thing. But under the legislation we've passed, you couldn't get more than you need to provide that service, and you couldn't keep that information so that it would not be available for further manipulation. I think the answer to a lot of this is very tough privacy regulations that severely limit what personal information can be first acquired and secondly retained in online versions of platforms.
I see. And we've talked a lot about the potential misuse of technology. How do you think it might be used? What can we expect in terms of improving, for example, the access to voting or other components of our democracy through technology? Do you have thoughts about that?
Sure. I mean, we did a big bill through the committee I chaired in the last Congress, HR 1, which was the biggest expansion of voting rights and expansion of ethical requirements in modern history. A lot of it was using technology to allow people to exercise their rights, to be able to register to vote, to be able to cast their vote. There is a political divide, and Republican members of the House have told me privately and very openly they think they're better off if people are kept from voting, that Republicans will win if they keep people from voting. I think that's terrible, but people have told me that. So there really is a political divide on whether or not we want people, eligible Americans, to vote or not. There's a bigger issue in terms of misuse, which is coming at us, and I don't think we know the answer right now, which is AI. We had last week a very interesting discussion with Sam Altman, who's one of the leaders of OpenAI. They now have a situation where they can, with almost complete precision, identify holes in cybersecurity. Okay, well, that's a very useful thing. I mean, to plug it. However, if you can identify all the holes, you can also launch an attack, a cybersecurity attack. So how do you, Altman has been pretty open that he thinks there need to be some guardrails that are binding, not just voluntary, to deal with the biggest threats of AI. I'm game to do that, but the question is how to do that. And I think we don't know that answer yet, and I'm not sure that Altman does either.
I see. And here's a very specific question. Why don't we vote online? So you could argue that, I mean, it's certainly going forward, everyone is going to be online as a part of our day-to-day existence and experience. And if we wanted to increase voting, would that be a way to do it?
I have a great deal of skepticism about that. For one thing, we do not have complete security when it comes to cybersecurity. So if we worry about manipulation, there's a big concern there. Number two, it's about perception. We had an ex-president who tried to convince the public and succeeded among some of his followers that the election had somehow been stolen or rigged. And the way to disprove that was that all of the ballots ultimately were on paper. And you could say, well, he's saying the machines manipulated, but if you count 100,000 paper ballots and it comes off within one or two, you know that those statements are incorrect. Now, the cultists, the facts don't matter to them, but for people who are living in reality, having a physical ballot, I think, is the ultimate protection against not only manipulation, but manipulation of fear. And I think we're very far from when online voting will be secure.
And you've used the word manipulation a number of times. I'm wondering, what's the line between manipulation and something like political advertising? So I'd argue that since political advertising has existed, we've been attempting to manipulate people, sure, right? And move their emotions around and try to convince them vote one way or another. So what's the difference between the manipulation that's occurring now and the manipulation that's been going on forever?
Well, I mean, to say that there haven't been lies by candidates in American history would not be correct. That has happened from time to time over decades and decades. What is different is the dissemination of lies about reality, not opinion, that now is extreme to the point where people believe something is factual when there's really no question about the facts. you can have a fact and have a different opinion about where that fact leads you, what you should do about it. But having, 30% of Republican Trump voters or more believe that he won the election when in fact that there were manipulations that did not exist, that not me, Republican elected officials went through, counted the ballots, did the analysis, and it just factually was incorrect. That's quite different than saying, here's fact A, and we ought to make this or that view of this fact.
And so given the technology, I don't imagine we're going to put the genie back in the bottle in social media technology. Is it really possible to eliminate that kind of misinformation? Because it seems to be about the ability to spread lies, and now the megaphone available to people is immense. So help me think about what would make you optimistic about this being managed.
Well, I do think there's possibilities. Honestly, some have suggested that there ought to be liability for companies for those who whatever is posted on their site. I think that's a tricky matter because only the big companies will have a single chance of complying with that, and startups will never be able to comply. And so it would have a tendency to consolidate market power among the existing platforms. Additionally, I think what that likely leads to avoid liability is just simply not having the capacity to have postings on particular topics. And that probably is also not a good idea. I mean, there's opinion about facts, and then there's lies. And our free speech foundation for our democracy protects our opinions and vigorous debate. So how do we get at just the outright lying? One of the things that has I thought been very interesting that the Dominion voting machine company, they've sued. They sued Fox News, and Fox News, just as anybody who posts on a social platform, if you know what you're saying is false and say it anyhow, you have some liability under the defamation laws. And I think that could go a ways towards cooling the jets of those who knowingly spread falsehoods. But I also say, I think all of this is going to be very much changed soon, because when AI becomes rolled out in the way it's coming, it's going to have a tremendous impact on the utility of the social platforms as they currently exist.
I see. And speaking of that, what is my last question? What are your hopes for the future, and what are your fears?
Actually, I am very hopeful for a couple of reasons. One, we have made some scientific advancements in these last few years that are very promising for the country. We got ignition at the fusion experiment at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and that is a landmark and something that gives us cause to believe that within a decade or two, that we might be able to bring fusion energy into our world as a source of limitless, non-polluting energy. That will change everything, because a lot of what I think underlies the manipulation of people is a sense of lack of prosperity and grievance that allow people to be divided. And if those disparities and disappointments economically are not as prevalent, the capacity to divide will also be diminished. I'll say also, when one of the reporters asked me going into the January 6th committee, what would be a success? And before we had our first meeting, and I said, a success for me would be to end the committee with a big chunk of the American people having a renewed passion for democracy and a renewed commitment to defending it. And actually that did happen. And there are people who are still heedless about the threats, but I would say there's been a sea change across the country of people understanding we don't get to have democracy just because we're Americans. We have to stand up for that democracy. We have to stand up for the Constitution. And that gives me hope for the future.
Yeah, I see. And what do you fear most about the direction we're going in?
Well, obviously, climate change has the capacity to completely upend our trajectory towards prosperity and hope as humankind. And so that's, a very big deal. I think as people despair, there is a tendency to turn to totalitarianism, which is something that is we all must oppose, whether it's totalitarianism on the right or left. That's inimical to a free society. So that's a concern.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your time and your answer to all my questions. Thank you so much.
Have a good day.
You too. Our next conversation will take place on February 20th at 6:30 Pacific time, and we'll explore the future of Web3, crypto, and tech. And our guest will be Amit Saru, professor at the Stanford GSB, and Mercedes Bent, partner at Lightspeed Ventures.